So let me talk briefly about communication and language. So I'm going to use some terms semi-inter knowledge differences between them. So communication is essentially behavior that involves transferring knowledge to others. So that's not a really great definition, but when I do something that causes someone else to behave differently, or when someone does something that causes me to behave differently, what is happening between us is some form of communication. Transfer of information, transfer of an antecedent to behavior. So my behavior is being influenced by someone else, or someone else's behavior is being influenced by me. In a broad sense, that's what communication is. Language is a specific kind of communication where there is a specific protocol for communication. It could be a physical protocol like sign language or body language, right? Like when I nod, that has a specific meaning, as opposed to general communication based on my physical presentation. And then speech is a really specific, speech and writing are really specific forms of language-based communication. So when we talk about autism, for instance, we talk about functional verbal and functional nonverbal communication. Functional verbal communication, we call it functional because we are achieving something by communicating. We're not just communicating arbitrarily. Verbal communication means talking and listening. But functional nonverbal communication means communicating via body language and gestures. So waving is functional nonverbal communication. But let's start by talking about language, which is a really big chunk of what we're interested in with communication. So, as previously noted, language dominance is typically a left hemispheric function in most right-handed individuals. More than 90% of right-handed individuals. And the remainder are mixed dominance and rarely right hemisphere dominant for language. So in left-handed individuals, in contrast, 50–60% of them are left language dominant, and the remainder are in mixed states, or occasionally right-handed dominance. And as I mentioned before, there's a two-factor genetic model that can explain this. And one variant codes for the traditional presentation, and when that's absent, you get a random presentation. And so some people are left-handed, but they still have left language. Some people occasionally are right-handed, but they don't have left language. But most people are right-handed, most people are left language, meaning for most people, the left hemisphere is dominant both for language and motor control. So, for the purposes of the lecture, we're just going to stick to that standard dominance model. The concepts apply to people who are not right-handed, and to people who do not have left language, although what will happen is there either will be activation of homologous regions in both sides of the brain. What I mean by that is if Broca's area is a certain part of the frontal lobe on the left hemisphere, for people who have mixed dominance, there's going to that same region on the mirror side, on the right side of the brain, is also going to be involved in productive language. If they're right dominant, then there's just a Broca's area on the right side instead of the left side. But we'll stick with the left hemisphere model, just to keep it simple. So we talk about two particular areas that are crucial to understanding communication: Broca's area and Vertigus area. And Broca's area, broadly speaking, is involved in productive language, or expressive language. Vertigus area is, broadly speaking, involved in receptive language, or understanding. There's also a connecting pathway, like bidirectionally, called the arcuate fasciculus, that we'll talk a little bit more about, but it's important in understanding the system. And then it's also important to know right from the bat that this Vertigus area is sensory, Broca's area is motor, expressive, motor, action, receptive, sensory input. So it's important to note that Vertigus area is not your auditory cortex. It's fed by your auditory cortex. Nor is it your visual cortex. It's fed by your visual cortex. Similarly, Broca's area isn't your motor strip. It doesn't actually move your mouth, but it feeds your motor strip. So, because again, that motor strip, precentral gyrus is right here. So, let's take in this model. Let's start with production, the motor side. So, Broca's area, the motor part of language, is in the inferior left frontal lobe. Again, if it's not left language, then there's maybe Broca's areas on both sides of the brain, or there may be a Broca's area on the right side of the brain. But in most people, it's the left frontal lobe, and it's crucially involved in the production of language. And Vertigus hypothesized that this area handles motor memory of speech sounds. So Broca's area was identified with this patient Tan, we just say Tan, Tan, Tan. And so he wasn't able to produce language. And what you should know about Broca's aphasia, the classic presentation of aphasia that primarily affects Broca's area, is first of all that the speech is telegraphic. So the words, the output of words is reduced, it's staccato, it's not fluent. And the meaningful content is relatively less impaired than the rest of the language. So the person has something to say, but they have trouble saying it. The first things to go are the functional words. That's the telegraphic part. If you have a hard time imagining how people would use a telegraph, the idea is that you had to pay by the word, and so you would write as little as possible, right? So pretty much just like text messaging or Twitter, you don't have very many words to work with or characters, so you keep it as short as possible. What are you going to eliminate? Things like articles and prepositions because you can communicate the meaning without them. Little action verbs, are unlikely to go as well. In contrast, the last things you're going to eliminate are the nouns because they convey the actual meaning, right? Like if you say water, people will figure out that you're hungry. But if you say get me, people have no idea what you want, right? So water and drink are the words that you're going to try to avoid eliminating because they carry the meaning. And so the telegraphic speech is going to be relatively sparing of the content words, which in this case are the noun and the verb. Although those are going to be affected as well, it's going to be highly impairing on the other words that flesh the sentence out. In addition to the telegraphic characteristic, there's anomia. So there is a loss of ability to generate the names themselves, the content words. And there is also a problem with articulation deficits. And Broca's aphasia classically was thought of as a lesion of Broca's area, but and it was primarily thought to be a productive aphasia. Classical Broca's aphasia is actually a little bit more complicated than that. Typically, there is subtle but observable comprehension problems. Those comprehension problems mirror the deficits in speech, production of language, and so receptive agrammatism, meaning if the receptive content has to be judged based on its grammar, there may be errors. And I'll show you an example of that from the book in a moment. Broca's aphasia can be caused by lesions to Broca's area, but actually this classical aphasia picture arises when Broca's lesion area is not only lesion by itself, but also frontal structures and deep white structures that adjacent to Broca's area are also affected. And completely separate from Broca's area, basal ganglionic lesions can also cause similar symptoms, particularly the head of the caudate nucleus. The basal ganglia, again, are involved in selecting and enhancing or suppressing behaviors, and so they can cause failure to select and enhance or suppress speech, and that makes speech disfluent, and so you can have basal ganglionic lesions that cause the same thing. So here's an example of that agrammatism. So here are two pictures with a horse and a cow, and so if I say to you the horse kicked the cow, the grammar component of this is understanding which piece is the subject and which piece is the direct object, right? So the horse kicked the cow is this one, the horse is the subject, kicked the cow. This one, the cow kicked the horse. So people who are agrammatic are going to, so first of all, they're telegraphic, so they may say horse, cow, they may say horse, cow, kick. They're not using they're not, for instance, sequencing them into a grammatical structure, the horse kicked the cow. The receptive problem is the same. So they're not going to be able to, they're going to struggle to tell the difference between these two. So if you tell them the horse kicked the cow, they're going to have trouble picking this one out over this one. So if you give them some similar examples, they're going to make more errors than most people make. So here's another example. I actually don't think I'd ever seen this in color before, but a black and white version of this classically is from something called the Boston Diagnostic Aphasia examination. The BDAE was was constructed by some really famous people in psychology, including Edith Kaplan, who died a couple of years ago in Boston. And originally, a lot of these cognitive neuroscience applications in neuropsychology were developed because at that time, there were limited availability of tools to assess lesions inside the brain. And so behavioral tools were used to figure out where in the brain lesions occur. Whereas now you can put the person in a CT or MRI, find that answer out quickly. And these behavioral tools were developed at a time when that was not available initially. And so the Boston Diagnostic Aphasia examination allowed people to characterize different kinds of aphasia. This was not that long ago, so I mean, if you think about it, these tools were not available a couple generations ago. So in terms of training pedigrees, at Florida I trained with neuropsychologist Dawn Bowers. She did her fellowship with Edith Kaplan. So it was 2 generations professionally ago. So Edith Kaplan developed these pictures. So, in part, so this picture is a complicated picture. There's a lot going on, right? There are lots of relationships, grammatical structures, like the boy is climbing the stool to get the cookies. And the mom is distracted by the water, distracted by something, and so she's cleaning the dish. She doesn't know that the water is spilling. She doesn't notice the kid stealing the cookies, and so forth. There's a lot of rich content, and that content can be used to determine if these different kinds of errors are occurring. For instance, if I ask you to tell me what's going on in this picture, you can do a variety of things. Like if you have neglect, you might only tell me what's going on one side and not the other side. But with language skills, do you tell me a fluent story? Does it make sense? Are the grammatic relationships correct? For instance, I can also evaluate things like the prosody of your speech. So I can tell a lot about your language from just asking me to tell me about this picture. So that's productive language. It's because I'm asking you to tell me about the picture. You don't need receptive language to be able to tell me about the picture. You just need productive language, expressive language. So what about comprehension? So comprehension is the sensory component of language. Comprehension is mostly associated with the left superior temporal gyrus, or Vertigus area. It's in the sensory cortex, right? Because the frontal lobe is motor cortex. All of this is sensory cortex. It's in the sensory section. Broca's area was in the motor section. So now we're talking about sensory aphasias and sensory comprehension of speech. So comprehension is mostly associated with the left superior temporal gyrus. And Vertigus suggested that this area was auditory association cortex. And it remembered sequences of sounds that carried word meanings. And so Vertigus aphasia causes poor speech comprehension, so ability to follow verbal commands and recognize spoken words is impaired. But it also actually affects productive language. Just like Broca's aphasia had some effect on receptive language skills. So the Vertiga effect on productive language is not a lack of fluency. Vertigus aphasia patients are fluent. What's wrong is that the functional words are lacking. So the content words are lacking. So you've seen slides like this before. Here's another example of a double dissociation. Again, you see an opposite pattern in 2 disorders. Broca's aphasia, they lack the functional words, like the prepositions, linking verbs and so forth, the grammatical structure. They have the content words. Vertigus aphasia, they have the functional words, but they lack the content words. So in Vertigus aphasia, there's fluent, meaningless speech. And it goes on, but it doesn't tell a story. So Vertigus aphasia is a primary example of sensory aphasia, but there is a motor component, or a productive expressive component. And that's because you need to be able to get the meaning. The meaning of words is stored in sensory memory. And so the word associations, more posterior, more temporal. The association between the word sound and the meaning is stored here. That meaning can't be accessed in order to put the content words into speech. So here's Vertigus area, here's Broca's area, the motor area, the sensory area. I mentioned that there's a connection, the arcuate fasciculus. And then there are sensory association cortices, motor planning and motor execution structures that are communicating with these. So sensory information is going into Vertigus area, motor plans are going out of Broca's area, and ultimately to the motor strip. So there are other kinds of aphasias besides Broca's aphasia and Vertigus aphasia that affect these transmissions of information into Vertigus area or out of Broca's area. That transmission of information is called transcortical. And so there are transcortical sensory and motor aphasias. And a transcortical sensory aphasia is impairment of the transmission of information into Vertigus area. The transcortical motor aphasia is impairment of transmission out of Broca's area. So if these fibers coming out are a lesion without lesioning Broca's area, you get a transcortical motor aphasia. And if these fibers coming in to Vertigus area are lesioned without infecting Vertigus area, you get a transcortical sensory aphasia. The key thing that differentiates these transcortical aphasias from the aphasias that affect these structures is this presence of this arcuate fasciculus, right? Because if you think about other structures, like if you sever the spine, you lose your motor functions, even if your motor cortex is intact. What's unique here is the reason that you don't lose all the same things that you lose when you lesion Broca's area is that there's a direct connection from Vertigus area to Broca's area that allows you to take information in and spit it back out. And so that allows you to repeat. So for instance, I can sing along to a song that's not in English, right? And I can sing along fairly accurately to the song, especially if the words go slowly enough, even if I don't understand the language that it's being sung in, because I can repeat. I can say a nonsense phrase, and you can repeat it back to me even though you don't understand what I'm saying, right? You have a built-in ability to repeat. That built-in ability is developmentally crucial because it's what you use to learn words when you didn't know them when you were a toddler. When you were a toddler. That is based on this direct loop via the arcuate fasciculus. And so when you impair these output structures, you don't affect repetition. And that's the difference between Vertigus aphasia, in which repetition is impaired because this fasciculus transfers from here to here. So if this is gone, there's no communication. In transcortical aphasia, once things do get to here, they can be repeated, and so repetition is intact. So transcortical aphasias impair sensory input to Vertigus area or motor output of Broca's area without disrupting the areas themselves. And because repetition works via this direct loop, via the arcuate fasciculus, it's unaffected. And so the defining characteristics of these transcortical aphasias is they have the deficits in fluency or comprehension, fluency for the expressive motor aphasia, comprehension for the sensory aphasia. They occur in the absence of a deficit in repetition. So I want to, actually, let's skip this slide for a second. Here's a diagnostic tree that basically incorporates all that information. So when you're diagnosing aphasia in the classical picture, the first question you ask is the person fluent? If they're speaking fluently, then it's a sensory aphasia. If they're not speaking fluently, then it's a motor aphasia. Okay? So in the motor aphasia, suppose they're speaking fluently and you knock out, they're not speaking fluently, so you knock out all of these. The next question is, do they comprehend? If they don't comprehend, it's not just Vertigus area, it's not just a Broca's aphasia because comprehension is affected. One possibility is a mixed transcortical aphasia. So there's transcortical sensory and motor aphasia. In that case, you'd be able to repeat because with the transcortical aphasias, you can repeat. If you can't repeat, then it's a global aphasia. Here, you're not fluent, you don't comprehend, and you can't repeat. You lost all of them. And then similarly, there's a transcortical motor aphasia in which you can repeat, but you can't comprehend, and you're not fluent, or you can comprehend, but you're not fluent. So the only thing knocked out is fluency. If fluency and repetition are knocked out, then it's Broca's aphasia. And then on the sensory side, there's transcortical sensory aphasia, Vertigus aphasia is the same, except you can't repeat because the arcuate fasciculus is knocked out. And then for people who are fluent and they comprehend, if they can also repeat, there's no gross aphasia. That's called an anomic aphasia. You're fluent, you can repeat, you can comprehend, but you just have trouble finding words. And then if they're not able to repeat, that's a conduction aphasia. This last one is special because when the model was proposed, the idea was that there was Broca's area and Vertigus area. There was an arcuate fasciculus that connected them. So people hypothesized that if there was such a situation, then severing this arcuate fasciculus by itself should only affect repetition but nothing else. So going back to this picture, in Broca's area, in Broca's aphasia, repetition was impaired because this input was inhibited along with Broca's area. In Vertigus aphasia, repetition was impaired because this output of the arcuate fasciculus was impaired along with Vertigus area. In these transcortical aphasias, repetition was not impaired. So if you sever this, the only thing you affect is the repetition. That's conduction aphasia. And it was hypothesized that that would exist at the time, and it turned out that it did. And in repetition aphasia, in conduction aphasia, only repetition is affected. So, for instance, if I say the auto's leaking gas tank soiled the roadway, the person might say the car's tank leaked and made a mess on the street. So, what I want to cross-reference here is, you think about your basic repetition ability. My example of singing in a foreign language. Suppose I sing along with an Italian opera. I'm going to make phonetic errors, right? Because I should tell you, I don't speak Italian. So I'm going to make phonetic errors because I don't understand what I'm saying. So if I make mistakes, they're going to be mistakes based on the sounds that I'm repeating because they sound wrong to me. Look at this. These are semantic errors. Auto is replaced with car. And soiled is replaced with mess, right? And so if I'm repeating a foreign language, I'm never going to make errors like this, right? Because I don't know this alternate related meaning Italian word to intrude it in the sentence. So my repetition system doesn't work this way. And so this is not being driven by my repetition system because my repetition system wouldn't make mistakes like this. So this conduction aphasia turned out to exist and be based on this arcuate fasciculus being severed without affecting any of the other structures. Let me also mention briefly on this. So there's a couple that shouldn't make sense here. Conduction aphasia and anomic aphasia. They don't fit into what we've been talking about so far. We've talked about the transcortical aphasias, this one and this one. This one is just both transcortical aphasias at the same time. We talked about Vertigus and Broca's aphasia. This is essentially Vertigus and Broca's aphasia at the same time. These last two, for people who are fluent and comprehend, don't fit into the picture. So conduction aphasia is one, anomic aphasia is the other one. So anomic aphasia doesn't have a deficit of fluency, comprehension, or repetition. And it happens because of posterior lesions, because the word meaning content is posterior in the temporal lobe. It creates a fluent anomia, meaning you can't find words, but you can talk. You can talk fluently. You can get the meaning across. You just can't find the words that you want to say. Oftentimes people with this kind of word finding deficit will say that it's on the tip of their tongue. And it's essentially a forgetting of words. And this forgetting of words is seen across disorders, but in particular word finding deficits in the temporal lobe are seen in a temporal lobe affecting dementia, specifically Alzheimer's disease. And so the Boston naming test, for instance, is a classic test where you show pictures, you ask them to name them. If they can't name them, you give them a hint to try to get the word out. The Boston naming test is a test of confrontation naming, or naming in response to visual confrontation. So this forgetting of words can be elicited. So this posterior network, sensory network, has word meaning knowledge, semantics. The anterior network is more action-oriented, and so the verbs are more anterior, the nouns are more posterior. Anomic aphasia is going to be most visible in nouns. And that's why the naming in response to visual confrontation. And so you also see this if you've ever heard of the MMSE, a really quick screening tool, mini mental status examination. In the MMSE, it's typical to hold up a pencil and ask people to identify what it is, point to a clock or a watch and ask people to tell them what it is. Those are naming tests. Those are really easy ones. They can't name a pencil or a clock or a telephone. Their aphasia is going to be pretty bad. The Boston naming test and other naming tests are going to look at less common objects because you're going to lose less common pieces of the semantic network first because they have less associations. You've got lots and lots of neurons and connections that deal with common words that are high frequency, relatively less for those low frequency words. So it's last in, first out essentially. Those complex low frequency words are the ones you forget first, so you need to elicit those to understand anomic aphasia. Let me back up a step. So I jumped into talking about aphasia, and aphasia is a lack of speech ability, right? A lack of productive spoken language ability. Just as a reminder, the dis and a prefixes are used in multiple ways that can be confusing, so be careful about these. One way of using them is that dis means partial and a means complete. So dyslexia means you have trouble reading, but alexia means you can't read at all, in that kind of sense. The other sense is developmental versus acquired. Dyslexia means that you were born with an innate trouble learning how to read. Alexia would happen after brain injury or stroke or something like that. I don't want to get too wrapped up in these, but keep in mind that in particular with reading and writing, these deficits can be either acquired or developmental. And they're going to look a little different in those two cases, because in the acquired model, there's going to be a lesion to the brain that affects certain structures, and whatever is passing through that region is going to also be affected. Whereas in the developmental model, it's not a lesion in the brain, it's just an abnormality in development. It can be very specific to something. It can also affect multiple things in a related area, so multiple aspects of reading, for instance, can be impaired at the same time. So dyslexia versus alexia, dysprasia versus aphasia, and dysgraphia versus agraphia. They're used in multiple ways. I don't want to get too wrapped up in that. What you'll find is that everyone will tell you that only one of these is right, but then there are lots of examples where people use the other one. And so what we do is kind of mishmash. And according to some of these schemes also there are nonsensical or redundant phrases like developmental dyslexia. Okay, so that is spoken language. That's the basics of aphasia, which is a deficit in spoken language. Let's talk about other aspects of deficits in speech. So there's a few other things that can be impaired besides fluency and comprehension and repetition. So prosody has to do with the use of intonation and emphasis to convey meaning beyond the level of the words. So for instance, you might say something like, I'm going to kill you, and depending on how you say I'm going to kill you, people might recognize that you're being humorous, or they might actually think you're intending to kill them. If you don't have the prosody right, people don't understand what your intention is. You might also use emphasis to explain the relationship between words. So for instance, you might say, close the door, to emphasize that the thing you want to close is the door. You might say, close the door, to emphasize that they already understand the door is involved, but they need to understand that they want to close it. So you can convey additional information using intonation and emphasis, especially in atonal languages like English. And so it's also crucial in communicating emotions. Prosody has to do with rhythm of language, the sing-songy nature of language. And many timing and sequencing tests are left hemisphere, but prosody is more of a holistic aspect of language, and so it's more right hemispheric. And right hemisphere strokes and TBIs can alter prosody. It's also abnormal in some developmental conditions, particularly autism. And so kids with autism will have unusual prosody or rhythm and intonation variation of language. The inflections will be strange. And that's a kind of a hallmark characteristic. There's certain speech patterns that are associated with autism where this prosody is very clearly for that reason. In these lesions, so you can have a lesion of producing prosody, you can also have a lesion of receiving prosody, and so you can actually be unable to use that aspect of language to understand what's being communicated, and you won't be able to tell the difference between the different kinds of prosodies. And so, for instance, you could do tasks that you could present a phrase like you could say it's raining outside. So it's raining outside could be neutral, like it's raining outside, just a statement of fact, just like I'm telling you today's Wednesday. It could be negative, right? Like if I wanted to play a soccer game, it would be like, it's raining outside, or it's raining outside. I might say in one of those kinds of frustrated or sad voices. I might also use prosody to indicate that maybe I like playing in the rain, so I'm just like, it's raining outside, right? So you can do tasks where you can offer words, you can offer a phrase, for instance, an ambiguous phrase, you can offer it with different prosody valences, and you can see the detection accuracy there. Or you can take an unambiguous phrase, like, I just lost my job, right? It's very rare that you can be excited about that. So you can take that unambiguous phrase, and then you could say incongruent prosody or incongruent prosody. So you could say, I just lost my job. Or you can say, I just lost my job, right? The second one is strange. It should sound strange, because it'd be weird to be excited about that. So you can detect, for instance, cognitive neuroscientists might look at, for instance, that second one, which is incongruent, should take longer to process if prosody is functioning correctly. So you can test receptive prosody as well. So prosody has to do with the sing-songy or rhythmic nature of language. And stuttering is a different kind of fluency problem. So stuttering is a neurological condition. It affects about 1% of the population, mostly men, but also women. And it has specific patterns. So in the fluency loss in Broca's aphasia, it's a continuous kind of fluency loss. Stuttering is more of an initiation problem that has to do with the beginning of sentences, and a planning problem that has to do with long grammatical constructs within a sentence. So it's a deficit of selection, initiation, and execution of motor sequences. And stuttering seems to be related, at least in part, to faulty auditory feedback for internal sounds. And it's important to know that you hear internal sounds differently than you hear external sounds. They're body-centric. Stuttering rarely happens when you are cued by an external sound. And so, for instance, people who stutter will rarely stutter when they're singing along, like if they're singing along with a CD or something like that. They won't stutter in that kind of context. Whereas people with Broca's aphasia, they can't repeat or speak fluently, and so they're going to be halting even when they're repeating or speaking along with you. You can do a delayed auditory feedback therapy where essentially you have headphones that isolate external sounds and play back your own speech, but with a time delay. You can actually use that to increase temporal processing and fix stuttering. And then there's also fluency shaping behavioral approaches. And when you do these, you increase temporal activity, which is probably correlated with analysis of one's own voice in the temporal lobe. And there's a correlation between increased temporal processing and treatment response, which suggests that this auditory receptive cortex, the sensory cortex is involved, sensory association cortex is involved in stuttering. However, I do want to mention that when you hear this description of stuttering, particularly this, you should hopefully be thinking about what we described the basal ganglia as doing. And the basal ganglia have also been strongly implicated in stuttering. And there's some things that are consistent with this and potentially interesting. So for instance, excess dopamine receptor development in the basal ganglia will lead to stuttering and also lead to precocious language development. And in particular, this time when these dopamine neurons and receptors are being developed is the time when early onset stuttering happens, typically developmentally. And so there's some evidence also from lesional models that says that the basal ganglia may be involved in stuttering. makes conceptual sense because this basal ganglia select and enhance or suppress words. And so if you have to select a motor plan for speech, and you have trouble selecting which one, you're going to kind of choke and be in an ambivalent state, and that's what happens with stuttering. So these are other aspects of spoken language outside of fluency and comprehension. Yes?
I just have a quick question. Is this prosody can be caused by strokes and TBI? What does TBI stand for?
I'm sorry, traumatic brain injury? Yeah. So traumatic brain injuries, in general, from like a kinetic standpoint, are not focal. You hit your head and it has diffuse impacts in your head. But there are two ways in which traumatic brain injuries can cause focal lesions. One is through bleeding. So you can have a bleed in a certain part of the brain because that particular blood vessel gives out, and there's a hemorrhage or an ischemia. And so you can have a particular part of the brain lesion during TBI. You also have Coup and Contrecoup effects. So suppose you have a TBI because somebody hits you in the face with a bat. So when somebody hits you in the face with a bat, there's a direct impact here, right? So there's going to be a lot of damage centered here. But then as the brain is accelerating backwards, it's going to hit the back of the head. And that's a Contrecoup effect. So if a force, like a blunt force, affects the head, it's going to cause a lesion. It's going to cause more lesions right where the impact was. And then it also